So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first Paid Family Medical Leave Insurance Rules Advisory Committee meeting, otherwise referenced as the PFMLI RAC. I am Ann Friend. I'm the Employment Department's Agency Rules Coordinator, and co-facilitating with me is Lois Williams, the PFMLI Operations and Policy Manager. Thank you, everybody, for rearranging schedules so that you can attend this RAC meeting on sort of short notice so we can get things moving. Today is Wednesday, September 29th at 9 a.m. This meeting is being recorded and will be retained as part of the official record for rulemaking. Further instructions will be done shortly after we go over some general information. Everyone is muted except for RAC members and OED staff. RAC members are able to mute and unmute themselves. The purpose of the chat is for technology issues, and the purpose of the Q&A is to capture comments and questions for the public members that are attending and not the RAC members. If we have time at the end of the meeting, we will take speaker requests in the order they appear in the Q&A section for this meeting. Therefore, please put your name in the Q&A section and indicate that you want to speak at the end of the meeting if time allows. We will call upon those who put their name in the Q&A section at that time. We will unmute your microphone when we call your name. We may not be able to answer all questions from the public during this meeting as it depends on the remaining time available. However, we will consider and review all comments put in the Q&A section after the meeting. You're also welcome to send your comments to the OED_rules@oregon.gov email address, and then we will make sure that they get to the appropriate program staff. We ask that RAC members who have questions or comments, please raise your hand within Zoom and make sure you are unmuted and we will call on you. We will do our best to call on you in the order that we see hands raised. If we call you out of order, please let us know if you need to. This is the first of several RAC meetings for the PFMLI program. This RAC will be reviewing the proposed administrative rule drafts in batches as the PFMLI program develops them and prepares for the formal public rulemaking process. We are scheduled for a 9 to 12 meeting today, and we will take a break about halfway through. If you need to step away, please make sure you mute your microphone. Today, we are addressing batch 1 rules. If we don't get through the entire batch, we will schedule another batch 1 RAC meeting in the near future. We will send out an email poll to the members to narrow down which dates will work best for RAC members. We will do our best to pick a date and time that works for the majority if everyone isn't available. Hopefully everybody will be available and won't be an issue. Future meetings will be posted on the PFMLI website and will be distributed through our listserv distribution lists. RAC meetings are advertised and open to the public. The purpose of the RAC meeting is to hear from the RAC members and the stakeholders they represent prior to formal rulemaking. This meeting's primary purpose is to have discussions with RAC members and get feedback on the proposed rules and the statements of need and fiscal impacts for the formal rulemaking process. After all feedback is reviewed by the PFMLI staff and any changes made, if and where appropriate, we will move this first batch of rules onto the formal public process for rulemaking. The public members that are listening, we welcome you to listen to the committee's discussion. If you have questions regarding this set of rules, again, please submit them in the Q&A section or send them to the OED_rules@oregon.gov email address. We will not be addressing questions regarding UI or PUA today, only the PFMLI batch rules. Lois, if you'd like to begin with the particulars for today's meeting, go ahead.
Be happy to. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. We're very pleased that we've gotten to this point of having a large meeting to share our Batch 1 rules. Just a little bit about our Rules Advisory Committee. By statute, the PFMLI program has an overall advisory committee, and those individuals serve a 2-year term. They've been meeting for about the last year and a half. Those meetings are also available to listen into. They meet the first Wednesday of every month. Sometimes there's additional meetings that are scheduled too, as additional materials need to be discussed. So today I'd like to just indicate who we have present, and I can't see the list and everything, so I'm just going to ask each person to go on camera for a minute and or wave if they can to indicate that we can hear you and that your microphone is working when you unmute it. So the 4 individuals on our advisory committee who are serving on the RAC committee include Linda Herrera. Linda, are you able to join us today? Okay. I didn't see her name. If someone indicates that Linda's joining us, let me know. How about Andrea Peluso?
I'm here. Good morning.
Great. Thank you. Welcome. And Eva Ripito.
I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. And then our other member is Jess Viatora Gayancheta, and she's not available to be here. And I always get her name mixed up. I apologize, Jess, she's not here, but I believe that Katie Thiessen is substituting for her today.
Yep, Katie Tyson in for Jess Genatino Viatoro.
Thank you very much, Katie. And then we also have members representing employers, and Amanda Dalton. Are you here today?
Good morning, Lois. I am. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. And then, as I indicated a moment ago, Jenny Dressler also is here. She is the member on the advisory committee that specifically represents small employers. And Jenny indicated that she had a conflict, but she will be joining us in about an hour. Another member is Eric Hunter. Eric, are you present? Okay, I don't hear Eric, but he may be joining us. And then last, Paloma Sparks.
Yep, I'm here.
Great, thank you very much. And again, these are the members of our advisory committee. Today, they are serving in the capacity of the Rulemaking Advisory Committee because by statute, the advisory committee is charged with advising the department on many things, including rulemaking activities. So thank you very much for being here. In addition, we have several people from the department who are listening. These are many of our policy staff. So earlier, Anne introduced me. Again, my name is Lois Williams, and I'm the policy manager for the Paid Family Medical Leave Program. With us today, we also have Shannon Ball, who is one of our lead policy analysts, and you'll be hearing from her as she walks through many of the rules themselves. We also have several team members who are leading our teams developing the rules. We have Rick Heineken, we have Andrew Warren. I believe I didn't see Andrew, but we'll see if he's here. And then Kelly Ofoni. Also, if any of you are having technical difficulties, we have Mackenzie Hanley who is helping. Do use the chat if you're having trouble with hearing or seeing. She will try to help you if possible through the chat. But again, if you have comments or questions, please use the Q&A for that. Now, we have a lot of material. We'll go ahead and move to the next slide. We have a whole program to bring up, so we have a lot of topics to do administrative rules about. And we've divided that work into 5 batches. Today, we're going to be addressing batch number 1. But in order to give you some context, I wanted to walk through what the different batches are and what we hope to have them contain. Today's batch contains a myriad of rules dealing with contributions and what employers need to do in order to quarterly participate. We're going to get started with the rules relating to equivalent plans, but you'll notice that batch 2 also has some additional equivalent plan rules. Today, we'll be discussing the application process, some requirements that equivalent plans need to have, and what happens when those plans end or terminate. We will also be discussing how self-employed individuals make an application to have coverage, what requirements they must meet, and also what about when their plans need to end. We will discuss employer size. You'll hear a lot of terminology around small employers and large employers, and we'll talk about how employees are measured to determine employer size. And then if someone is a small employer, how do they access and utilize assistance grants that are available through the program? And then finally, we also have an outreach rule. This has been a very challenging year, and we haven't had a chance to do as much outreach as we had hoped, but we are ramping up to do so now. And even this opportunity is a chance to do some outreach, but we'll do a lot more. We have a new communications vendor that has just recently come on board that will be helping us with some large-scale mass communications and outreach to help us get the word out about this program. This batch, we anticipate meeting with this RAC today, and then we will enter into formal rulemaking where we will file the proposed wording of rules in batch 1 with the Secretary of State's office, and it will go out for a public process starting on November 1st. It will be open then for a public comment period. We will hold formal public comment hearings sometime mid-December, and then we anticipate that those rules would be filed as permanent rules starting January 1. Then the following batches would be also in the works, and we'll have overlapping processes. Again, I mentioned batch 2, we anticipate having the balance of the equivalent plan rules. This will deal with situations where employees have simultaneous coverage because they have 2 jobs. They have 3, 4, 5 jobs. What happens when they have, say, one position with one employer who is covered under the state plan, but then they have another position that is covered under an equivalent plan? How are claims, benefits, disputes, et cetera, resolved in those situations? There will also be appeals for equivalent plan employers. Say if they apply to have a plan and it gets denied, or how are benefits paid under those equivalent plans. So we realize that's the other half of the equation, and that will be in batch 2. We do anticipate that that process will start in a couple of months, and it would finalize by April. So into the early part of 2022, we'll be doing something similar here where we'll hold a RAC and then we'll go out for public hearings. Batch 3, we anticipate being another large batch that will deal with a lot of our benefits rules. Even though benefits don't go live until September 2023, we realize employers and employees need to know more about how the benefits are going to work in this program. And so we are already starting to get started on those rules now. Also, we realize that self-employed individuals need to know more about how benefits will be paid to self-employed people who elect into the program. And then we know there are some special provisions that apply to tribal governments who can also elect coverage. We've already done some outreach with the tribes, letting them know about this opportunity. They are, according to the statute, they are not automatically covered. Their employees are not automatically covered. However, we're working with the tribes to let them know they can make an election. The fourth batch of rules, we anticipate covering any kind of appeals processes. We do plan on adopting many of the Department of Justice Attorney General model rules dealing with appeals and hearings. Many of these will mirror current Oregon Employment Department processes through our Office of Administrative Hearings. And more to come on those, but those are slated to come a little bit later in the process. And then the last batch will really be any miscellaneous rules that we have determined are needed. We also know that with each one of these various topics, we have definitions that will be helpful as we write the rules. We have to kind of define some of the terms that aren't defined in statute. We'll do that now. You'll see today we have a couple of definitions that relate to contributions, and we have a couple of definitions that relate to employer size. Those rules will be added
Lois?
to with each of these. Yes,
Sorry to interrupt. Amanda Dalton has her hand up.
I just saw that, and I was going to get to her in just a
Okay.
second, and then we'll circle back to what her question is. Thank you, Anne. So just in recap, then, we have at this time 5 batches planned. The 5th rule will be kind of a catch up or catch all. And By statute, with the extended timeline, we anticipate that all of these rules would be finalized prior to the September 1st, 2022 final date. We hope to have them finalized before that, so that as we are out doing our education and outreach and presentations and webinars about helping employers and employees get ready for this program, these rules will be finalized prior to that date, if at all possible. Happy to take questions from the RAC members. Amanda, you have your hands up.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that, Lois. I appreciate you
problem.
running through all that. I guess my one question is, and I'm glad that we're here, right? We're a year and a half in, so it's nice to see draft rules on paper. I think that's going to help folks understand. I understand the necessity of the batches. I think one of my concerns or questions, though, is as we enter the formal rulemaking process and you file and adopt formal rules tied to batches, it would be nice to look at these in their entirety. And so I do get a little concerned about the necessity then to go back and say amend, filed permanent rules, especially like this first batch, where it would be nice to see how it works with batch 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I'm just wondering if the agency's talked at all about, delaying the filing or the publishing of the formal rulemaking process till we have a couple more batches drafts out there, so that we can do this as more of a big picture look rather than each of these kind of being more siloed.
That is a great question, Amanda, and we've tried to balance. We know that we need to get out there so that we can do the education, develop the forms. We are now building the system. We're working with the modernization vendor to actually design screens, customer service portals. So we're doing all of these things in parallel. And one of the things that we have discussed is, let's say we go out with batch 1 for the formal rulemaking starting November 1st. If today, and then if during that 2 to 3 month process, we get lots and lots of questions, we could delay the permanent filing from January 1 to incorporate more information about batch 2 and batch 3. So we have flexibility. Once we go out for public rulemaking and we announce the date of the public hearings, we will stick to those dates, but we don't have to stick to that January 1st filing deadline. We could hold it open longer to incorporate additional comments. So we will consider that as we progress through the next couple of months.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. It looks like Paloma, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I've heard a lot, especially from people who work in Washington, that having these sort of not being able to respond to the rules in full is really complicated, and to have them all sort of separated out into pieces makes it much more challenging to provide sort of meaningful feedback.
Thank you, Paloma. We had a little bit of an early start earlier this year. In December, January, February, we began posting some of the early draft rules on our website and asking for input. And that was one of the overriding pieces of feedback that we received was, it would be nice to see everything in batches if we could, so that we could take a look at everything dealing with assistance grants all at one time. But I realize even that needs to be taken a look at in light of the larger program and in context. So we have tried to have larger batches and get a little bit more information out so people can consider it. But we realize it's not ideal. We don't have all, and I'm just going to throw out a number, all anticipated 75 or 80 rules here. But we do want to get the process rolling. We know there's so much interest in this program out there in the communities, in industries. We want people's input. So we've decided to move forward, but we're going to try to have as much opportunity for people to review them in context as possible. So Andrea, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I appreciate that and the flexibility that you all are bringing these both in batches and with some opportunity to comment on them all together. I think I'm just concerned about the timeline and just wanting to make sure that we're not delaying any further the timeline to establish rules sufficient to start developing some of the technology systems and other things that are needed on the back end for this to roll out on time. I think we've seen really clearly over the last couple of years the true need for this program to be up and running as quickly as we can do it. So I appreciate the way you all are trying to do both these things at once.
Thank you. We really do hear the concerns, and we appreciate you speaking up about it. We're very aware of it. And if anyone has ideas about ways to mitigate, even maybe hearing a direction we might be going on something, we're happy to share our early thinking about the rest of the balance of these topics. So as we go through these, please feel free to share that.
Lois.
Anne, you had a comment?
I do. Just before you move on from the timeline and from the discussion of everybody having the opportunity to review and comment, because this batch 1 is slated to go to Secretary of State's office by November 1st to be in that bulletin. In order for the program staff to be able to do the finalization and preparation of all of the filing documents that then come to me so that I can file with the Secretary of State and send out all of the interested parties notices and all of that other stuff, we will need comments from RAC members by October 4th, if at all possible. And if that's not doable, then please reach out to Shannon, Lois, or I, and we will figure something out. Okay, I think I'm done now.
That's okay. We are co-facilitating today, so we just ask everybody for grace because this is our first RAC, and we're so excited. But if we forget something or if we have technology issues, thanks for bearing with us. I will say, you'll notice that as we go through the rules today, we didn't put rule numbers on. We are kind of doing that off to the side, but it's very early. So as you're addressing rules, if you could tell us which rule you're talking about, maybe by title or content, so that we can make sure that we associate your comments with rules, that will be helpful for us. And we have received some very good input in the weeks leading up to today. So I want to thank all of the RAC members who have already provided us with their thoughts. Please feel free to also share those comments today so that the broader group can hear your comments. As Shannon is walking through some of the material, she too will try to share some of the comments that we've received as well. Okay, at this time, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Shannon Ball and ask that we put the next slide up. Shannon, are you ready to go?
Yes, thanks, Lois. Good morning, guys. My name is Shannon Ball. I have met all of you, but just to introduce myself again, my goal today is to go through all of the rules that you received, which are 39 rules in this batch 1, and we have broken them up into 5 different topics, combine the rules that are similar in nature to these 5 topics. So we have contributions, small employers assistance grants, equivalent plans, self-employed individuals, and then the outreach rule. I'm going to take time to walk through each of these 5 different sections and provide an opportunity for the RAC members to discuss the rules within those topics. And like I said, we have about 38 rules that we're going to go through today. So bear with me here. And we're going to move on to the next slide. And we're going to start with contributions. And the contribution section is the largest section of all of our administrative rules. We have 20 of the administrative rules out of the 38 are in this contribution section. So the first part is talking all the wage rules that you can see here on this screen. The wage rules the statute establishes that wages for the paid family medical leave has a meaning given in the unemployment insurance statute. And this section of the administrative rules pretty much mirrors what the unemployment insurance administrative rules have for defining wages. These rules also match how the IRS treats wages. Since all of these rules are very similar to UI, I'm not going to go into detail of each of these rules, but just want to touch on a few of them that we received feedback on. On the disability payments and accident compensation rule, we may look at expanding other ways the IRS treats different disability payments and maybe expanding that to be more clear within our rule. For example, right now, insurance disability payments aren't considered wages, so we may be looking further into this and determine if we want to put anything in the administrative rule to make it clearer for everybody. I am able to go through every single one of those if that would be helpful here. Otherwise, I'm just going to first pause and open this up for any comments or questions or concerns that you may have within these first 10 rules on wages and how they're treated for paid family medical leave purposes. And Paloma, it looks like your hand is raised.
Yeah, it would be helpful if the rule clearly stated that these are consistent with UI. I mean, reading through, I think that's what you were intending, but I know that folks have been reading it and have not been understanding that. So if there could be something that clearly states that, I know the statute says that, but for folks reading it, again, reading it as sort of a comprehensive document, that would be helpful.
Thanks, Paloma, for that feedback. I'll figure out wording of how to incorporate that into there.
That might be something that we do in the outreach materials and the notices that we send out that goes out in addition to the rule language when we do formal rulemaking.
Thanks, Ann. Other comments or questions on these 10 wage rules? Okay, then we're going to move on to the second part of the contribution section then. Let me scroll down. In the document on the compilation of rules, the second section begins on page 4 of your compilation. So if you're wanting to follow along. So this section dives into all aspects of the paid family medical leave contributions. And just remember a high-level summary of the statute. The statute requires all employers and eligible employees to contribute to the paid family medical leave fund. The contributions will be paid at a rate determined by the director, which the director has not set that rate at this time for 2023 yet. And employees will pay 60% of the total rate, and employers will pay 40% of the total rate. The total rate will not exceed 1% of the employee's wages, with a maximum wage amount of $132,900. And that wage amount is adjusted annually by the Consumer Price Index. So I just want to give a little high summary before we go into diving into each of these rules. So the first rule is the definitions rule. And as the program goes on, we'll likely add to this rule several more times. So right now, this rule just defines legal fees and maximum wage amount, but we know we still need to define domestic employees, the definition of employment, place of performance, or where, meaning where is if the employee is in a transit job where they don't work in any state, how that is works for Oregon purposes. And we will be adding to this rule and included that later. Any questions about the definitions rule or comments before we move on? All right, the next rule then, scrolling down on the page, is the method for determining the contribution rate and maximum wage amount. This rule describes the information the actuarialists will use in determining the contribution rate annually by November 15th each year. The rule also explains that beginning with calendar year 2024, the maximum wage amount, which is currently $132,900, will be adjusted annually. We have received some comments on this rule about putting the rate out in November doesn't allow much time for system changes and communication, and maybe putting the rate out in September or October will give us more time. We're still analyzing those comments and discussing that, but just a little bit, we are still looking into this. We have chosen November 15th. I just want to explain some of the reasons why we chose November 15th, as this is the same date that UI announces the employer's rate. And so that announcement can go in the same envelope together, and allow us more time to gather information to analyze the base rate to have as much accurate of a rate as possible by incorporating what's in the fund at that current time. We also recognize this administrative rule may change a few years down the road when we actually have our own data that we can use, because right now a lot of the methodology goes into talking about using other data to incorporate that. So we recognize that this could be changed in the future, but for the start of the program, this is the data that we'll be using to figure the contribution rate. Questions, comments on that one? Amanda?
Hey, Shannon, I don't know if this is the right section for it or if it's the next one, but one thing I was thinking of when I was kind of rereading through this again is, you know, I know it's really clear in the statute that it's a 60-40 contribution rate split between the employer and employee. I'm just wondering if somewhere we should say that so it's really clear kind of upfront. I think it will help those small employers, especially that don't have payroll companies or HR teams to help them navigate these rules, that we just make it pretty transparent and put it out there, since we get into a little bit of the weeds about the employer withholding for both them and their employee contributions. So just a flag.
Great point, Amanda. We keep struggling with, you know, what do we put in rule and repeat from statute, or do we put it in forms and instructions? And so balancing that act as well. So thank you for your comment. We'll consider that. Andrea.
Yeah, just appreciate your note about using the existing data now, but really want to make sure as we move forward that the rate setting is informed by actual program utilization data over time and not projections as much as possible. And then also just suggest that we use and set and publish a rate setting formula, which is used in there are similar formulas used in a lot of other states. So wanting to make sure that the folks understand how we're arriving at that rate.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, being transparent, what formula we're using, and the actual information. Like I said, when we do get our own data, we do really want to use that instead of using other data. So thank you for that comment. Other questions, comments, concerns?
Shannon.
Yeah.
I would like to take this opportunity to just mention that the legislature back in, gosh, I don't know, the last decade, passed a bill that requires all agencies to do a 5-year rule review for any rules that were put in place after 2016. So all of these rules, after they become permanent and final, will in 5 years or less, if the program decides to do it sooner, will be reviewed in its entirety to make sure that it's accomplishing what it needs to accomplish, is still holding legislative intent and so on. So I just want to mention that before you go too much further.
Thanks, Anne. All right, well, scrolling down on the page, then if you continue on to page 5, is the maximum wage amount rule. So the maximum wage amount is determined per calendar year by each employer, not the employee. If an employee works for multiple employers, each employer must withhold and pay paid family medical leave contributions up to the maximum amount for each employee. We had a lot of discussion about this rule previously, weighing in of what we wanted to do. And ultimately it came down to per employer, because it provided less administration for the employer, the employee, and the department, and also looked at disclosure risks and concerns there. Paloma, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, the way this is written right now, like, I think I understand the intent, but the wording that's in here is a little funky. The way it reads is that one of the employers could be liable for each of the employers. So I think the wording needs to change, so it would be from the employer, or instead of each employer, because the way it reads, you could interpret it to be employer A is responsible for not only employer A's portion, but also employer B's portion. And I think the wording needs to be fixed there.
Thanks, Paloma. So that's in section 1 is your suggestion for the, says that wages are subject to contributions up to the maximum wage amount earned from the employer per calendar year instead of each employer.
Yeah, and also in 2, I think using the wording each
Okay.
could still be interpreted to mean that the employer has an obligation for the full amount, not just their prorated amount.
Thank you for that, Paloma. We have people taking notes, and so that will be noted to look at that further. So thank you for pointing that out and specifying which parts are within that rule. Amanda?
Yep, just same flag on 2A and 2B that each term is a little confusing, and just appreciate the examples. I think it's always helpful, and just would encourage the simpler the examples, the better, so that we're not having to interpret complicated examples. But I know this is tough stuff, but I do think further clarity on making it clear that the employer is responsible for theirs is helpful. And we'll just point that this is again where that contribution 60/40 from the previous section would be helpful, so that it's clear for both an employer and an employee when reading these to realize that 2A and B are specific to the employer and to the employee.
Okay, I have a question, Amanda, to follow up with that. Example 1 and example 2, as written, do you think they are easy or complicated to understand? Like, should we make them clearer, or do you have any feedback on that?
Probably like in the middle. Not a great answer for you. I mean, I thought they were clear. I had to read them a couple of times. That may be a better, maybe Paloma, if she had gotten feedback, or even Andrea on the employee perspective, did that read clear enough?
Okay.
I think it would be helpful to have the employer perspective, the employee perspective in one of those examples.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. All right. Other questions or comments on the maximum wage amount rule? Thank you all for that feedback. Okay, moving on then. The wage reporting and contribution payments rule. So what this rule says is all employers have to file the Oregon Combined Quarterly Payroll Report to report Oregon paid family medical leave. The good news is the Form OQ and 132 is currently being updated to allow paid family medical leave to be reported on that one form and not have a separate form. The payment due date is the same as the current due date for the Form OQ and 132. So it would be the month following the end of the quarter. The rule also says, however, domestic employers who are already allowed to file annually for unemployment purposes and have less than 25 employees on average can continue to file and pay annually. So they will not have to meet the quarterly requirement, filing and paying requirements. That is in summary of what that rule says. Paloma, you have a question?
Yeah, so I would just like it if it would be possible to have the rule clearly state what you just said, Shannon, about the combined form and the due date. I've received some questions about that. So if we could put that, I don't know if it goes in 1, or maybe it goes in 1 and then 3. That would be helpful.
So maybe linking even the due date that's already written in another statute, linking that. Is that your suggestion, maybe? Yeah,
or just clearly stating that this will be combined with the UI reporting requirements. That would be helpful.
Thank you for that feedback, Paloma. Other comments, questions? All right, scrolling down then to page 6, we have the application of payments rule. This rule explains how the department will treat a payment if the payment doesn't come in with a payment coupon. And it explains where if you don't come up with a payment coupon, where we'll put the payment. We call those undesignated payments. So under undesignated payments, they'll first go to the oldest debt and be applied to penalties, interest, and then the paid family medical leave contributions in that order. And then it will go to distraint warrants. If people do send in a payment with a coupon specifying where they would like the payment to go, the payment will first be applied to legal fees, then penalties, then interest, and then the paid family medical leave contributions. Again, this is how UI treats payments. And again, these are undesignated payments are payments that weren't specified where they want them to go, and designated payments are you provided a payment coupon, or you specified in the information you sent in with the payment where you want the payment to go, which is a designated payment. Any questions, concerns, comments on that administrative rule? All right. I'm going to keep moving on then. Scrolling down. If you go to page 7, we have deposit bond or letter of credit rule. This rule allows the director or an authorized representative of the employment department to demand a deposit, bond, or an irrevocable letter of credit if there is a risk of the paid family medical leave not being paid. The risk could be, but is not limited to, someone who is currently delinquent in filing and payment of paid family medical leave contributions, or was previously delinquent in filing or paying. Again, this is similar to a UI rule as well. Questions, comments, concerns on that one? All right, then I'm going to have the slides be advanced to slide 8. Where we'll talk about the last group of rules in the contribution section. So these rules deal with penalties and other miscellaneous items as it relates to contributions. So first we will talk about the 1% penalty. Per the Oregon Revised Statute 657B 910, it requires the department to send a notice by June 30th if all reports and payments haven't been made. If there's still no response, then by September 1st, a 1% penalty can be assessed. On or before November 10th, the employer may request a waiver based on good cause. So this rule states that the department denies the waiver, we will notify the employer and let them know they have 20 days to file a contested case hearing. Again, this rule is also based on UI's rule, which I have the rule number if needed as well. Any questions or concerns? Amanda.
Sorry, I'm going to keep going back and forth, and I understand the nuances of trying to minimize how much of the ORS you're copying into the rule. But on this one, I do think it may be helpful to just clarify, because it is significant, right? Is that the 1%, I believe, I'm looking right now again, it's tied to all wages of the employer's employees in the preceding calendar year. So just to make it really clear that we're not talking 1% for the quarter you miss, we are talking about 1% of the entire preceding calendar year, just pursuant to 910.
Perfect. Thank you for that feedback, Amanda. Other questions, comments? All right, moving on then. Going down, sorry. On page 7, then we'll go to the good cause or failure to file reports or pay contributions administrative rule. This rule defines what good cause is and gives the time frame of when items need to occur, which is also how the UI defines good cause and the same items. The employer needs to give notice to the department of all the factors and circumstances that cause the filing or payment delay, and file and pay the contributions within 7 days after the factors or circumstances that cause the delay do not exist anymore. That's in summary of what that rule does. Any questions, comments, concerns on that one? Okay. moving on. We'll scroll to page 9 now, which has the compromise of amount due administrative rule. This allows the director to compromise on amounts due if a settlement criteria is met. In summary, so others can get into a settlement agreement and we can compromise on what is due depending on facts and circumstances of that case. Any questions or concerns on that one? Okay, then moving on to continuous jurisdiction. This is where the statute and the rule state the director. When the statute or rule state the director, this rule expands that the director means that they can also delegate to the deputy director, division director, and deputy director of paid family medical leave program and other employees to fulfill those tasks or needs. So it wouldn't be just the director. Okay, that is all of the contributions rules. So we made it through the biggest group of rules, 20 of the 38. And before I move forward to talking about the statement of need, do you have any questions on or overall comments on all of those rules as a combined effort amount? All right, then we can go to the next slide then, which is where we're going to talk about the statement of need.
Shannon.
Yeah.
Before you begin that, does anybody need a break? We've been going 45 minutes. I just want to make sure that nobody needs a break before we switch topics. Seeing no hands. All right.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Okay, we're going to talk now about the statement of need. I sent those to you this morning and recognize that you have not had time to review them. So I'm going to walk through these a little bit more and actually have Mackenzie pull them up. But before she does, the statement of need is a place where is a requirement that we need to file with the Secretary of State when we file the rules. And we can group like-kind rules to one statement of need. So we don't need a separate statement of need for each administrative rule. The rules we just went over for wages, contributions, and penalty waivers are all related to paid family medical leave contributions. And so we'll be filing all of those rules together with the Secretary of State on the one statement of need. The purpose of the statement of need is for the agency to explain the fiscal and small business impact for those administrative rules. And remember, this isn't impacts that were caused by the statute, but rather impacts that were caused by the administrative rules themselves that we just went over. These are all, you'll also see information with administrative rules. This will be posted with the Secretary of State bulletin. When we post the administrative rules, the Secretary of the statement of need will go out with it. And again, this morning, I just sent you the 5 different statement of needs. I recognize you have not had time to think about these. So I'm going to go over each document today and welcome your comments and would like any written comments by next Wednesday, October 6th. So I can incorporate those changes. The first one I'll go over is contributions, and then that will finish the set of the rules. So in your packet of information that was sent to you this morning, if you could pull up the document titled Contributions Statement of Need, we can follow along, and I'll also have Mackenzie put it up on the screen, which it looks like she just did. So if you scroll down to the on page 4, which is I'm going to start the fiscal impact. I'm going to kind of jump around on this document. So the fiscal and economic impact is in the middle of page 4. This is where the fiscal and economic impact section is, and we don't feel any of these administrative rules that we just talked about have a fiscal or economic impact, but would love to hear from you guys if you feel differently. Okay. The next section is the statement of cost of compliance. And in this cost compliance section is where we talk about the impact to state agencies and small businesses. So after looking at all these administrative rules, we feel the impact on state agencies, local governments, and other public bodies was all created by the statute, requiring them to withhold from the employee's wages the paid family medical leave contributions, and not from these administrative rules. But going down further on the effect of small businesses, looking at it further, we said Oregon has approximately 126,000 small businesses with fewer than 50 employees and 120,000 with fewer than 25 employees. Since all employees are eligible for the paid family medical leave benefits, all small employers are subject to these administrative rules on paid family medical leave contributions. And scrolling down a little bit more, we stated approximately 2,500 agricultural employers who are not subject to the unemployment insurance filing the Oregon Combined Payroll Report annually. Based on contributions, wage reporting, and contribution payments administrative rule, agricultural employers who currently file annually to report other taxes on the Combined Payroll Report will need to file and pay paid family medical leave contributions quarterly. Our best guess on how long it will take someone to report and pay the paid family medical leave contributions quarterly instead of annually is, our guess was 2 hours a quarter or 8 hours a year. Based on QuickBooks cost of payroll projections, that cost can range anywhere from $29 an hour to $150 an hour for someone to assist with payroll. Again, that all depends on what product they use. Do they do that by themselves? Do they use QuickBooks, a payroll company, an employee within that company, or other means? And it also depends on how many employees that they have. So this was really challenging for us to come up with an average time allotment that this would take. So depending on the type of service used, the cost range could be anywhere from $232, which was the $29 multiplied by 8 hours for a year, or up to $1,200 a year, which was the $150 multiplied by 8 hours a year. So based on hearing those last couple of assumptions with the small businesses in the impact, do you have comments, questions? Feel that the numbers are incorrect? I would love to hear anything from you guys. Paloma.
I mean, I think 8 hours a year is a pretty much of an underestimate. That's, and I'm not sure that would be accurate, particularly for businesses that, may not be using technology or may not have a service provider. I know that I have certainly spent more time than that on these things for my purposes. So,
thanks, Paloma. Do you have? I know that I'm putting you on the spot. So, do you have like a rough estimate of what you think it would be? Keeping in mind that this is for them filling out the paid family medical leave portion of the combined payroll report. So it would be entering the employees' names, their wages for paid family medical leave purposes, and indicating the employee portion of the contribution and the employer portion of the contribution, and doing that each quarter.
So, I mean, I would
doing
say,
it once a year.
I would say if you are an employer who's doing it yourself and you don't have sort of a payroll provider, one, separating out what are actual wages and are subject wages and what are not subject wages is not necessarily a simple thing. Particularly, I would say, in the early part of this is going to take a lot longer for employers to complete. I just think 8 hours a year is that, I mean, I could see somebody spending 4 hours on it easily, at least at a minimum, the first time they have to do it.
So Paloma, if I'm understanding what you're saying, right, you're saying that you feel like this is underestimated, one, and two, are you thinking that the 8 hours is more like quarterly, or not? I'm sorry, not quarterly, but monthly instead of quarterly or annually? Would that be more of a accurate picture?
I think assuming 16 hours a year is probably a lot more likely. than
Okay.
8 hours a year.
Okay.
Thanks, Paloma. I really struggled with this because I totally understand what you're saying of having to come up with the amount, the wage amount for each employee and stuff like that. But they're already having to do that on the annual filing. And so that's where I was struggling of like, okay, how much difference would this be doing this annually, all this work annually versus doing it quarterly? And that's where I was really struggling with and coming up with an hour amount. So I welcome any of your feedback. Lois.
Yeah, this is exactly the type of discussion we were hoping to have today, so thank you. One of the things we also are challenged with is that we know this program itself in the statute requires so much of employers and employees between the notification and reporting on the combined filing. So it's very hard to segregate out how much of this is required because of the rule versus the statute. And we don't have all those answers. So we're glad to have the discussion, but that's one of the criteria that we come back to too, is that the statute says people have to file on the quarterly combined. And so we are thrilled that it's not going to be a separate filing. We're trying to make it as easy and as efficient for employers as possible. But when I take a look at those numbers of 126,000 small employers and 2,500 agricultural in this one example, we have so much variety between sophisticated tools or someone manually sitting at their kitchen table filling out a form for 2 employees or 500 seasonal employees. There's so much variety there. But if there's any ideas you have about ways to capture that spectrum, we would love it. So thank you very much for the discussion.
Other people's thoughts? All right, then just scrolling down a little bit more on this document, down to equipment and supplies. That we think is equipment, supplies, labor, and increased administration for these administrative rules. And again, the only item that we identified is what we previously just discussed, which is the increased administration for agriculture employers. And the next question on this document, if we scroll down a little bit more, talks about how small businesses involved in the development of this rule. And we just put in here that we talked a lot with you guys about these topics at the advisory committee meetings, and at least one of you represents small employers. We also met with 14 members who were appointed by the director on the contributions work group, and that work group met over 12 times over the last year to discuss the various topics we just discussed today. And so that's how we included small businesses in the discussion of these administrative rules. And then the documentation that we relied upon. Here are just a few documentations we relied upon. We have that we identified: the paid family medical leave statute, of course, the UI statute, since a lot of the paid family medical leave statute was created off of UI, and it ties us back to that for wages definitions, and that is just one of the examples. We looked at the UI administrative rules, as we discussed already, and then some of the rules are very similar to UI's rules. So that is in summary of what's on the statement of need for the fiscal and economic impact and the small business impact. Now I'm going to turn it over to Lois to scroll back up to talk about the racial equity impact.
Thank you, Shannon. I'll give you a little bit of a break. You're
Thanks.
carrying a heavy load here. Wanted to share with you that during this last legislative session, the legislature passed House Bill 2993, and that particular statute requires that state agencies include a racial equity impact analysis whenever they're doing rulemaking. And that bill does not become operative until January 1st of 2022, but the Employment Department understands that this program has far-reaching impacts for all different types of communities across the state of Oregon, and we'd like to be an early adopter of this provision. And so we are attempting here, this is our first time putting this out in front of the rulemaking. We would like to incorporate a racial equity impact now as part of our statement of need and get your feedback on it prior to going into formal rulemaking. So again, it's not required, but we really have built racial and other equity components into our program that we want to have our program based on including diverse cultures throughout Oregon. And so we are making an attempt here to do that. As we are developing these statements of need, we have tried to determine what does that mean to do a racial equity impact for rulemaking. And as a starting point, we've come up with a couple of questions that we've tried to address. What are the racial equity impacts of this particular rule, policy, decision? And who will benefit from it or be burdened? And are there strategies to mitigate any unintended consequences? So just like the fiscal impacts of the rule, we have to take a look at, is the impact from the statute and the program itself, or is it from the rule itself? So we've taken a look at this batch of contributions rules and tried to determine what are the racial equity impacts. And so I realized we just got these this morning from us, and we thought we would go through them with you at this meeting, get in any initial comments that you have, and then ask that you provide us any feedback again by next October 6th with any other of your RAC comments for the rest of this process today. So Mackenzie, if you would scroll down just a little bit for this particular set of rules. We did say that in drafting these rules, we know that the division has been careful to ensure that we're thinking about racial equity as we do all of these rule developments. We know that there have been disparities over time, especially with Black, Indigenous, Latina, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, and other people of color, and their businesses that may experience barriers in learning about the requirements of the program. In particular, we're aware that penalties could disproportionately fall on those same groups, as if they are business owners, if they're less likely to have staff resources dedicated to regulatory compliance, such as a separate human resource department. So we know that with more and more requirements placed upon small business, it becomes more of a burden in some cases to meet regulatory requirements. We are aware that the combined payroll reporting process may present barriers for non-English speaking businesses. And so the department is committed to making those services available in other than English languages as well. Now, are there strategies that we can take to mitigate those unintended consequences? Yes. We are committed to developing resources and devoting resources to provide equitable access. The vendor that we are working on to build our system, the customer service portal, of course, meets all of the required access capabilities. And in addition to that, I'm just kind of scrolling through this statement at the same time. We are going to make information, tools, and processes widely available. We're working with the technology vendor to ensure that the registration process for businesses is accessible and available in multiple languages, as well as having a paper process and staff ready to assist in assisting employers with reporting and ongoing requirements. We will be creating many more frequently asked questions. We'll have video instructions. We'll have guides that will address the Oregon Combined Payroll Reporting process and other tools like a calculator to expand awareness and education, making all materials available in multiple language to mitigate some of those disparities. And additionally, the division will be conducting focused outreach and engagement activities from now through implementation and beyond to those marginalized communities. And then finally, we're going to be monitoring a number of data elements and exploring ways to have flexibility in the technological solution should disparities begin to arise in the program so that we can recognize them early. And I realize that's very high level, and I realize that's a lot to just kind of put out there, but we're happy to take this as a starting point for your input. We are thrilled to get any additional input. I see, Amanda, you've got a comment.
Yeah, I think this is great, Lois. Obviously, we did just get this morning, so I'm going to be very honest and say I haven't read it. This is the first time I'm looking at it. So I will just tell you my initial response to the stuff that was up above, which I think has been scrolled down now. I think it's important to note that the racial lens is on both sides of the table. And your proposal today speaks very heavily towards the racial lens for the employee and not for the employer. So not only do you have business owners of color, but you also have businesses that have come to the table when the legislation was being crafted about the desire to provide this service, and they just frankly couldn't afford it. And so what we've done is we've crafted a proposal that allows them to afford it and provide it, because we have two parties contributing. And so I think it's important that the racial equity impact recognizes all sides of participants in this program.
Thank you, Amanda. I hear you. Thank you. And again, it's also very, just to add to that, again, I'll come back and I'll say this program does have so many racial equity impacts in the program statutes itself. And so it's very hard to say, well, is this impact here from the rule, or is it from the statute, the underlying statute? And how do we in fact divide those two, because they are so interwoven? So thank you. We will take that into consideration. Any other comments on this particular statement of needs, racial equity impact inclusion?
Andrea has a question.
Yes, Andrea.
Hi. No, I would just wanted to appreciate that the agency is moving forward with including a racial equity impact in our rulemaking in advance of the required timeline to do that. And I know that that probably means that you're operating without much guidance about how to do these impact statements. And I just would love to have more discussion, maybe through our advisory committee meetings or otherwise, about to approach doing these impact statements throughout the rulemaking. I think these questions are good. As Amanda noted, I haven't fully thought about this from this morning, and we'll do some more thinking about whether there are some additional questions we need to be asking as it relates to kind of the process overall. I imagine these questions may be fairly consistent across the rules we're considering. So just wanted to offer some support and support in bringing in other folks to help think this through.
Thank you very much.
Lois, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
The questions that we have and that we've answered are from the GARE assessment. And they were also, if not directly mentioned, peripherally mentioned during the hearings during the legislative session. So that's how we came up with those questions. We figured that they were a good starting point, at least until DOJ gives us some guidance, which should be coming hopefully in the next few months.
Thank you, Anne. And you're absolutely right, Andrea. No other state agency that we're aware of has actually adopted this new provision yet. And so, yeah, we welcome input, because we're flying in the dark as far as what is expected from the legislature with this new legislation. So thank you. Okay, I am going to say, I think we've gotten through the largest batch today. Shannon, did you have anything you wanted to wrap up on this particular statement of need and use before we move on to the next category?
I don't have anything to add. Thanks, Lois.
Okay, then I'm going to recommend that this is a great breaking point for everyone to just have 5 or 10 minutes. Anne, is a 10-minute break appropriate at this point?
Yes, I would think so. I think it's a good natural break. We did the heavy stuff and then we'll get into some more heavy stuff, but give our brains a break.
Okay, then I'm going to ask Mackenzie to go ahead and just pause the presentation, and we will come back in 10 minutes at 10:20 to restart. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Do we have everybody back?
And would it be all right if I just did a quick roll call of the RAC members, because we may have had some join us since earlier today?
Yes, please do. And then I want to make a mention about the Q&A that we're getting.
Great. Okay, great. Well, then it's 10:20, so we'll just see who's here back from the break. Paloma, are you present? Okay. How about Eric? Has Eric joined us? Was Linda able to join us? Okay.
Hi, this is Paloma. I'm here. Sorry.
Oh, great. Thanks, Paloma. Good to have you back. Okay, and Andrea, I see you are here back from the break. Thank you. How about Ava? Is she here?
Yes, I'm here. And I should also note that I will need to leave at 11. So if I disappear at some point.
Okay, thank you
because
very
of the-
much for letting us know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, and Katie, are you present?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, and Amanda Dalton?
Yep. Back.
Great, thanks, Amanda. And Jenny Dressler, have you joined us yet?
Yeah, I'm right here.
Oh, great, thanks. Glad to have you here today. Thanks. Okay, Anne, go ahead, please. You were going to share with us.
Oh, yes. So we are getting quite a few questions in the chat and in the Q&A. We are getting into the rules that we feel are going to be more conversation between the RAC members and the OED staff. So what we're going to do, if we don't have time at the end of this meeting to answer all of the questions, is we're going to create a question and answer document, and we will put it on the PFMLI website for everybody to access.
Thank you very much, Anne. Okay, well then, in the interest of time, we're going to keep going with the next category of rules. And so I believe that Shannon is ready to go with small employers and assistance grants.
I am. So as we said right before the break, we've just made it through the biggest portion of the administrative rules. And this next section has 6 administrative rules of the 38. This section consists of small employers and assistant grants. And they are grouped together because we first have to determine your employer size to determine if you're eligible for assistant grants or not. A little reminder of what's required in statute. So ORS 657B 150 subsection 4 says that the employer with fewer than 25 employees are not required to pay employer contributions. And ORS 657B 360 states a method must be adopted to determine on an annual basis the number of employees employed by an employer. I'm just going to begin by walking through the small employer administrative rules, which begin on page 9 of the compilation document. So the first rule is just definitions. This rule defines how we calculate the employee count, which is a head count of all paid family medical leave wage employees. That is those employees reported on the form 132 that have PFMLI wages, plus the number of out-of-state employees. There's going to be a box added on form OQ that have you enter the number of out-of-state employees. So it's a number that you write down, not the employees' names. And then you'll subtract the number of employees you have working temporarily due to them being replacing an employee who is not working and is on eligible paid family medical leave. The employee count will be reported each quarter. The employer size is then determined by the employee count by taking the average number of employees in a 12-month period. And we'll be talking about this further in the next rule of how that is actually calculated. Then if the average is 25 or more, you are considered a large employer. And if it's less than 25, you are a small employer, sorry. We recognize that there's going to be some winners and losers with the department determining employee count, because each business is different. Remember, this count will only determine if the employer has to pay the employer portion of the paid family medical leave contribution or not, which is 40%, and if the employer qualifies for assistant grants or not. The employer does not need to pay the paid family medical leave contributions on out-of-state employees. And also the employee doesn't have to pay paid family medical leave. The out-of-state employee does also not have to pay paid family medical leave contributions. Oregon's paid family medical leave contributions are only paid for employees working in Oregon. And we chose to include in the count out-of-state employees for equitable purposes. We wanted to treat all businesses the same. An example that we came up with is if you have a business that has all of your 28 employees working in Oregon, you would be considered a large employer. And if you have a business of having 20 of your employees working in Oregon and 8 working in Nevada, we are also going to consider you a large employer because we are counting the out-of-state employees. So that way both businesses are being treated the same. That is just a little discussion on the definitions, and I'm going to move next into the rule for method to determine the number of employees employed by an employer, because both of these kind of align, and then we can have a discussion after that. This rule explains who to determine or how to determine the number of employees. So quarterly, you're going to count the number of employees that I previously explained, which is the number of Oregon employees, your out-of-state employees, and you subtract out the people that are temporarily working for you due to an employee being on leave. Due to the paid family medical leave, just starting in January of 2023 and not having this information, the employer decides the termination for the calendar year 2023 and 2024 are going to be a little different than what we do in 2025 and going forward. For 2023, the employer size is determined for all of 2023, but what is reported on the first quarterly combined payroll report, which is filed on April 30th. By June 1st, the department will send a notice to each employer, letting them know their employer size and if they're considered a large employer or a small employer for all of calendar year 2023. Again, we recognize there's going to be some winners and losers with this calculation by just doing it off of the first quarter of 2023, but we have no data to go off of, so we have to start somewhere. We also looked at the ease of employers for reporting and paying purposes. We thought it would be confusing if the employer had to go back and amend their quarter report later in the year or do something different after those first 2 quarters. I'm going to pause for the 2023 calculation and open it up for discussion or comments, questions, concerns, anything. Katie.
Yeah, thanks. So I might be jumping ahead a little bit, so I really apologize if that's the case. But yeah, so a couple comments, concerns on this section. One, just really want to appreciate kind of what you laid out in terms of the challenges of not having the full complete data prior to 2023. And so really want to figure out a solution there. But you know, as the proposal reads right now, do have some concerns that it's pretty out of alignment with statute in terms of that 12-month look back immediately preceding the date that the determination is made, right? So want to find a solution there. And I think in particular, only using Q1 for 2023 has some significant concerns for us, particularly in industries where Q1, so January 1 to March 31, is really the low season, right? So construction, retail, agriculture, just looking at that first quarter, I think in many instances does not capture accurately the employee count, and that has big effects for the program, right, broadly, and for potentially some of the workers. So just wanted to raise that. The only other thing, and I think, again, this might be jumping ahead a little bit, is would like to see the rule just call out some parameters of making sure that folks are not misclassifying workers to get under that 25 threshold. So, you know, if an employee is an employee, they should be defined as an employee and not something else just for the sake of getting under that threshold. It should be legitimate.
Thank you, Katie. Like you said, yeah, we have been really wrestling with not having all the information. And so how do you go back, you know, and reconcile that? And so again, we welcome any, you know, in writing later, we can have some other conversations of suggestions because we would welcome any of that. Thanks. Other questions about 2023 before I move on to how we calculate 2024? Lois.
Thank you. Thank you, Katie, for the comments. Could I just ask a follow-up question? Because I just want to make sure I understood what your input. You said that there were some impacts to the workers, but in this particular provision, I know we're talking about the size of the employer and whether that employer is required to pay the 40%. The employees are still required to pay the 60%. So I just want to make sure I understood what you meant by impact to the workers on the way the rules currently
Yeah,
proposed.
absolutely. Appreciate that follow-up. And I think this is probably mostly a conversation for a different batch. But anywhere in statute where there is a differentiation between how 25 plus employers are treated essentially and 25 and under. So the place that I saw in statute is around the retaliation and job protections. So again, probably a conversation for another day, but that is the other place that I saw in statute where there is a distinction between the two.
Thank you. That does help me put it in context, and especially in light of your concern about potential misclassification of employees. Yeah, thank you.
Amanda.
Yeah, I would just say as we continue this conversation, and I know we've had a lot of this in the RAC subcommittees, but the statute's pretty clear. I think it's a little, I won't say disingenuous, but challenging to say that employers are miscalculating or misclassifying their employees when it's pretty clear that what the definition of an employee is and isn't. So I guess any clarifying language that would be added to this rule, I would ask that it go back to at least to the full RAC for further discussion, because I don't see the gap, and I don't know if Katie has a recommendation on what she's asking to be added for the employer to make that determination, but it just seems like the statute's pretty clear.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly happy to provide some language. I think that's right, and just like making sure it's crystal clear in the rules. It's not going to hurt.
Thank you. I'll just throw out there that, yeah, we're so interested in all of your input, and especially if anybody wants to put it in writing. We always take wording suggestions as well. Thank you. Jenny, you had something.
So I'm going to reiterate, kind of going back to the definition of who an employer is and the way that you calculate. I know I've raised the issue several times, but I do think that that in including employees out of state, we are actually going to be disadvantaging small businesses that are located either on the Oregon-Washington border or the Oregon-Idaho border. And this is, at least in the RAC conversations, we had a lot of conversation about the importance, particularly for convenience stores or for restaurants that kind of operate, franchisee owners that operate in both states and may have a relatively small footprint in both states. But the training grants were really important for them to be able to access, particularly for food safety training, for alcohol and tobacco training. They were looking at $3,000 to train each worker anyway. And so I'm just really concerned, or a minimum of $3,000 to train a new employee, really concerned still that is the formula that we're working off of. And kind of based on what I've heard from some of our folks who do have operations, they were anticipating being able to qualify for the grant here in Oregon, and now they're not going to be able to, which really does put them at a disadvantage. So I guess just want to lodge my opposition to that definition. I would like to be able to work with you guys on something that really does provide those accommodations, or at least consideration that was considered during the legislative session when we all worked on this, and in the previous, I think we worked on this for several years on who should be able to access those grants and why. And so I just really worry about these small businesses, and particularly those that have a lot of employee turnover already. This is what they were asking for, is just the ability to be able to access a training and an employee replacement grant. So that's the first concern that I have there. Staff also stated that you subtract out any temporary employees, that an employer, I'm guessing that's the secondary employer who has the temporary employee. Again, as it relates to the primary employer, if you have a temporary employee on assignment let's say you're located in Washington, you have one on assignment, just want to make sure that I think for the purposes of that temp agency trying to understand which state they're operating in, whether it's in Washington, and again, I hear this in the context of Washington, under the Washington rules, or if they have a employee on temp assignment in Oregon, I think that needs some additional clarity and maybe some work with Washington State just to understand how they are addressing the same issue. So thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. I just have a follow-up question. And maybe we can do this offline, but if you could provide like a couple examples, I would love, of businesses that would love to look at that further to see if they have the same BIN number or if they're two separate business identification numbers, because then that would be two separate filings. Okay. And so how all that will work out. So if we can connect, that would be great.
I'll ask them that. That's a good question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Andrea.
Yeah, we've gone around about this before, but I'll just reiterate here my concerns about that comment from Jenny about it disadvantaging employers who actually are not qualified as small employers who have more than 25 employees, but because they're at multiple locations or on borders of our states, want to be able to access the grants. I think it actually is pretty well defined here what a small employer is based on an employee count that should apply universally. And I worry it would actually disadvantage our small employers here in Oregon if we were allowing for those who don't qualify to access grants and to everyone who's paying in to subsidize those grants and that participation. So I don't agree with that, and I just want to flag that.
Okay. Jenny? Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, so as follow-up, I don't understand how that disadvantages small businesses who are here. These folks are still paying in. That's how you get the grant, is you pay into the program. So I'm not sure how that disadvantages anybody. And I'm also not assuming that these folks have 25 employees in Oregon. Many of these have 6 to 10 employees. As a lot of these smaller businesses located in Oregon, some of them operate across state lines. So again, I'm not sure how this disadvantages anybody. It allows the business to keep their doors open and to not close if they lose too many employees because they can't afford the basic training requirements for all of these new employees with employee turnover. So again, I'm not sure, Andrea, how your point applies, because it's just I don't see a space where other small businesses are disadvantaged because this small business pays in and is able to access the grant.
Okay, I'm gonna interrupt here because we do have a lot more to get through and we're on a time crunch, and you both have really good points. And I know that the staff are going to really consider those before we keep moving forward. And they will reach out to both of you for follow-up to make sure that your concerns are heard and definitely considered. So you both had really good points. Thank you. Paloma, you were next.
Sorry, I just wanted to note, Washington does not, and we had lots of conversations that we were doing this the same way as Washington does. Washington does not count out-of-state employees, they account in-state employees. If you are working in Oregon, you're not counted in under Washington's program, and I think that we should be consistent here.
Thank you for your comment, Paloma. Amanda?
And I apologize if I'm jumping around. I wanted to talk a little bit about sub 7 on the employer size method to determine number of employees. This is around the determination would be reassessed. So I spent a little bit of time trying to go back to the statute to find out, where this came from. I'm a little concerned by the way it reads right now that I guess one, it does seem to be a bit of a disincentive for an employer to revise or provide a complete report. Part of the intent behind the 1-year look back and providing employers, and I would say employees, that determination early and consistent throughout the entire year is both for the employer and the employee to be able to budget accordingly, right? So we have an idea of who's paying in and when they're paying in. And so I get a little concerned with 7A and 7B. It just feels very broad to me. It feels like it gives the employment department a ton of discretion to to trigger a different or a new count back. And so I just wonder if we can flesh this out a little bit more, and I'll try and do a little bit more kind of back on the legislative intent and as well as the statute. I couldn't find a lot of basis for it, so I wanted to flag it because it seems to be a pretty big one.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, we'll go down and talk about this, but it kind of aligns with Section 6 where it talks about if you haven't filed a report, then so you're delinquent and the department needs to make a determination. We're going to send in the letter, we're going to tell you that you're a large employer until you file your report. And so 7 goes with 6, whereas Section 7 is then saying that if you file a missing wage report, then we can go back and change that to a small employer. So that's part of what 7 is doing there.
Paloma, did you have one more question before we move forward?
No, sorry, I just forgot to take my hand.
That's okay. I just want to make sure everybody's got their comments in. So Shannon, if you want to keep going.
Okay, we're going to go on. We just talked about how it's calculated for calendar year 2023. So I'm going to move on to how we calculate it for 2024. The department will determine the employer size by September 30th of 2023 for all of calendar year 2024 by looking at the employee count for Q1 and Q2 of 2023, and then averaging those numbers together. So by November 15th of 2023, the department will send a notice to the employer letting them know their average employee count if they're a large or small employer for all of 2024. Again, remember, this is just to determine if the employer has to pay the 40% employer portion and qualifies for assistance grants or not. So in summary, that is what is happening for 2024 in the calculation. And then we'll move on to calendar year 2025 and forward. This is where we'll have 2 years of data, so we can actually go back and look at the previous years. The department will determine the employer size by September 30th of each year by averaging the previous 4 quarters. So we're going to look from Q2 and Q1 of the current year, and then we'll look at Q4 and Q3 of the previous year and average those numbers together. And then by November 15th each year, the department will send a notice to the employers, letting them know of their average employee count. And again, if they're large or small employer for the entire next calendar year. The rule then further goes on to explain how a new Oregon employer will determine their employer size. So the first calendar year is determined by the employee count on that first combined quarterly report. So within 45 days, the department will send a letter to the new employer letting them know of their employee count and if they're a large or small employer for the rest of the calendar year. And then for that new employer's second calendar year, the new Oregon employer will determine their employee count by averaging Q2 and Q1 of the current year and Q4 and Q3 of the previous year. If they don't have reports for all 4 quarters, we'll use the average based on those quarterly reports that were filed. And if the employer is not, again, this is just to require them to pay the 40% or not. And this can be reassessed once a wage report is filed. So then talking about Section 6 and Section 7, if there's not a wage report filed, then we will determine that they're a large employer at that time until they file that wage report. And just to summarize it at the very end, the employer size is not rounded. So if the average is 24.9, you would still be considered a small employer. We welcome any other comments or feedback on this. Lois, do you have anything?
Thank you. I just wanted to add to that, Shannon, and to many of you. Many employers already know what they are. They have 5 employees. They've always had 5 employees. They still have 5 employees. They're a small employer. Many employees have 500 employees. They're a large employer. They're doing great. Economy is good for them. They're doing great. The vast majority of people aren't even affected in this way. And so you may be asking, why this convoluted calculation? As we've indicated, there are lots of employers who have seasonal work, and they're the ones who may be impacted. But again, many of them are going to fall way below or way above. It's really that narrow stretch of people who are in the middle. But by the department validating that information and sending it back in some kind of a notice or a letter or a, hey, here's the rate for the new year. According to our records, you are a small employer or you are a large employer. As a large employer, you'll need to pay the full 40% from the employer. That allows the employer to get that validation of what they are. If there's any questions, then they can contact the department right then and there, get it straightened out right away so that they understand what the expectation is then for the following year. So I agree with you. Many people already know what their employer size is, but this will allow to make sure that we have a confirmation of that between the department and the employer up front, not at the end of the year or not every quarter because they're not paying in the 40%. So we're hoping that this helps clarify that this is for people who really, because of averaging, fall in the middle.
All right. We are going to move on then to the assistant grants section, which is at the bottom of page 11, starting on page 12. So just a little reminder about assistant grants. ORS 657B 200 allows the employer with fewer than 25 employees to be eligible for assistant grants if an eligible employee takes leave and certain requirements are met. There are two types of assistant grants. One is up to $1,000 for significant additional wage-related costs incurred while the eligible employee is on leave. And the other one is up to $3,000 for the cost of hiring a temporary employee while the eligible employee is on leave. Employers can get up to 10 grants in a calendar year and can only get one grant per employee in a year. I'm just going to explain the assistant grants rules and who is eligible for these grants. So the first rule is about eligibility. To be eligible for assistant grants, this rule says that the employer has to be a small employer at the time the employee starts the leave. The employer has to fill out an assistant grant application and provide the required documentation, which we're going to talk about next. The employer commits to paying the employer contributions for 8 quarters or 2 years, in other words, and the employer doesn't have an outstanding combined quarterly payroll report or payments. Another requirement for the $3,000 grant is the eligible employee has to be gone for at least 7 or more working days in order to qualify for the up to $3,000 grant. I'm going to then move on to the application requirements, and we can talk about both of these rules together. Oh, Amanda, before I go on, then you have a question.
Sorry, if we can just maybe stick there just for a second.
Yeah.
So I know it's probably there. I guess I just didn't see it in the statutes referenced on the requirement for the employer to pay for a period of 8 calendar quarters. And it's unclear to me if the commitment from the small employer is then to pay for their entire workforce for the employer contribution for 8 calendar quarters. I don't remember this being part of the discussion, especially when we're talking about $3,000 or $1,000 grants.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. This is not in statute, and so it is by administrative rule. And the thought was to have them pay for all employees, not just the one that they're taking leave for. So they would say, going forward, I'm going to continue paying, and so that way they're paying into the program, and not just when they want an assistant grant. That was the thinking behind that.
I'll just flag this. It probably won't surprise anyone on this call. That policy decision by the rulemaking committee will completely shut down grants for small businesses. There's absolutely no way. That completely makes this program moot in terms of grant assistance, and the whole entire purpose for the 1,000 and 3,000 for employers to get access to, which, as we've learned from Washington, is already a very difficult and complicated process to actually get. It's a pretty significant financial commitment for an employer to make then to get access, and we can run the numbers, but my guess is at the end of the day, it's not even a break even, and so most small employers won't even come near this program.
Thank you for the feedback, Amanda. If you want to again provide like other recommendations, that would be welcomed. Andrea.
I know it's a different situation, but it feels kind of consistent to other parts of the statute where we're saying, employers are opting in for their entire workforce, or they're opting into an equivalent plan for their entire workforce, but they're not allowed to like segment parts of their workforce to access different provisions, because we felt like that was a major inequity. And this rule feels aligned to those other parts of the statute in that way.
Thanks, Andrea, for your comment. Moving on to that application requirement. So what does it take to apply for an assistant grant with the department? The application will have employer information, so like their BIN or business identification number, information about the eligible employee taking the leave, name, social security number, claim number, start date of leave, and expected end date. And we did receive some feedback. Sorry, tongue-tied. We did receive some feedback on looking further into if we really need the social security number or ITIN number, if we already have the claim number there that's on the documentation. So we'll continue to be looking at that to help with disclosure purposes. But I don't have an update at this point. Type of grant requested and the grant amount requested will be on the application. The written documentation showing a temporary worker was hired and the cost of significant additional wage-related costs. And we recognize that the definition of significant additional wage-related cost does need to be defined, and we don't have that defined right now, so it will be added in the future. And then we'll finish the application by acknowledging the employer will pay the employer contribution for 8 quarters and acknowledge if later deemed that they didn't qualify, they would be required to repay the grant. The department won't review incomplete applications, and it won't count against an employer's application limit if the application is incomplete. Because reminder, they're eligible for 10 grant applications in a year, and they can only have 1 application per employee. So in summary, that is what is required on the actual application to apply for an assistant grant. And I welcome any comments, questions, concerns. All right, moving on then. Scrolling down the page to now we're on page 13, employer contributions. This rule just clarifies that once an employer is approved for an assistant grant, they must pay the employer contributions for 8 consecutive calendar quarters, so making that clear. And then the repayment of grants rule is grants received by the employer will need to be repaid within 3 years of receiving the grant if the combined quarterly report is amended and they no longer qualify as a small employer, or the department later determines information on the application was inaccurate or fraudulent. Amanda.
Sorry, I'm back again. Just because this is a little bit new and I wasn't on this subcommittee, so I'm playing a little catch up. So on the assistance grants for the employer contribution, so I understand that the proposal in these rules is that to be eligible small business grants, the employer then is going to become required to pay for all employers, all employee contributions for a period of 8 consecutive calendar quarters for their entire workforce. Is there any trigger for the employee to then begin contributing, or are you creating a completely one-off program now where you just have employers contributing to the program?
I mean, a great question. The employees will be paying the entire time. They'll be paying 60% of the contribution rate, the total contribution rate. And so this portion will just determine that the employer will then be paying the 40% portion of the contribution rate. So
that's perfect. Can we add that in maybe just for clarification so that this trigger doesn't change that formula?
Again, this is back to what I was discussing earlier today of like what to put in rule versus what's in statute, and not wanting to re-put stuff in the rule that's already in statute. And so that's where we'll have to take a look at that and see how that will work. And some of it might just be going in forms and instructions versus administrative rules, and it's still weighing how you do all of that.
I totally get that. I just think since this new employer requirement is not in statute, that it would be helpful for clarification to actually be in the OAR.
Perfect. All right. So that is all the rules on small employers and assistant grants. So is there any questions, comments, concerns about the overall of all those rules that I just talked about before moving on to the statement of need? All right, then Mackenzie, I'm going to have you go to slide 11, which is the statement of need for this small employer assistant grants. So in your packet of information that I sent you this morning, if you want to pull up the small employer assistant grant document, and Mackenzie will also have it up, pulling it up as we speak. And we'll scroll down to the document on page 3 where it talks about the fiscal and economic impact. Here is where we don't feel, again, any administrative rules that we just talked about have a fiscal or economic impact for small employers and assistant grants. But again, would love to hear from you if you feel differently about that. And then moving on for the small business impact, the cost of compliance section is where we talk about the impact of state agencies and small businesses. And we feel, again, that the impact on state agencies, local governments, and other public bodies is all created by the statute, and these rules will only impact them if they have less than 25 employees. And then the effect on small businesses by continuing to scroll down for the cost of compliance section. Oregon has approximately, again, 126,000 small businesses with fewer than 50 employees and 120,000 with fewer than 25. And since all the small businesses are eligible for the PFMLI assistant grants, if they elect into paying the employer portion of the paid family medical leave contributions, we feel that all small employers will be subject to these administrative rules. And then scrolling down just a little bit more, the rule requires reporting a head count on the Oregon combined payroll report for the paid family medical leave employees and the out-of-state employee count and the number of replacement workers. So based on our best estimate, we think the amount of time that it will take an employer to gather and write that information on the form OQ for the number of out-of-state employees and the replacement workers will be less than an hour to complete, because it's just writing an actual number. This reporting requirement could be done by the employer themselves, again, a payroll company, their payroll person, a professional, or someone else. And then based on the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the total compensation for a professional worker is on average $56.24 an hour. And so using that data, we anticipate that this rules require the application be filled out each time a small employer would like to apply for an assistant grant, and remembering it can be no more than 10 times in a year. And so this does vary depending on how many times they fill it out and the reporting requirements for the quarterly information. But we estimate that it'll take less than 2 hours to complete the application and gather the required documentation. Again, that's our best estimate, and welcome any feedbacks. Paloma?
Yeah, again, I would just say, I mean, I think we did not contemplate that this would be counting out-of-state employees. This is going to create a significant cost burden on employers.
Thanks. Do you, and if you can follow up later, if you have an estimate of how much time you think it would take employers to count their out-of-state employees and put it on the form, as well as subtracting out the employees that are there for leave for an employee that's already on leave. That would be helpful.
Can I ask a follow-up question to Paloma's comments? Paloma, thank you. You said it's going to have a significant impact. Are you talking about the counting piece, or are you talking about the fact that they potentially could be then a large employer and would have to be required to pay the 40% on their Oregon employees? Is that the piece you were referencing?
Yeah, and I think the way that this has been contemplated, I don't think you're going to see those employers that would have benefited from this small assistance grant likely won't participate. Which maybe that's what you want, because then there's no other money coming out of the fund. But and just the cost of trying to, and there's also opportunity costs. There's going to be employers that might think about having activity that are based in Washington that would think about having activity in Oregon. And if this is the interpretation, then they're just not going to expand into Oregon.
Okay, well, thank you. I wanted to make sure I understood where what was supporting your comment. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Andrea?
Yeah, I just want to hold that the more we create loopholes to allow employers not to count their actual employees, the fewer people, fewer entities we have paying into a program, which increases rates for everyone else. That is the way that it disadvantages Oregon-based employers. So I just want to
Thanks, Andrea. All right. The next question that we talked about on the statement of need is if there's any equipment, supplies, labor, or increased administration for these administrative rules. And as we previously discussed, the increased administration depends on, again, how many assistant grants are actually applied for. And then the last question here is how were small businesses involved? And again, as we stated previously, we have talked about several of these topics at the advisory committee meetings. And we have met with 14 members who were appointed by the director for the small employer work group. And that work group met 9 times over the last year to discuss these various topics that we did today. And to just summarize what documents we relied upon to help with these administrative rules, here are just a few. We relied on the paid family medical leave statutes. We looked at the following statutes of how others determine small employer count. So that was for UI purposes, Workers Benefit Fund, Oregon Sick Time, Oregon Family Leave Act, and the Federal Medical Leave Act. And we also looked at Washington State's program and administrative rules. So before I turn it over to Lois to go over the racial equity impact, is there any other questions on or comments on the fiscal impact and small business impact? And Andrea, I don't know if your hand's up or not. Okay, I'm turning over to you, Lois. You're on mute.
I apologize. Thank you. Well, once again, if you weren't here earlier, just again, this part of the statement of equity, or this part of the statement of need and use for rulemaking isn't actually required yet till January 1st, but the department is trying to be early adopters of including a racial equity impact statement as part of our statement for rulemaking purposes. And the questions that we asked are, what are the racial equity impacts of this particular rule policies, decisions, and who's going to benefit from or be burdened, specifically in relation to racial equity issues. So in these ones, you might see some very similar language to the one that we talked to about an hour ago, but I'll just read through this very quickly. And again, keep in mind, is it the statute that has the impact or the way that we have designed the rule? So in drafting these administrative rules related to the determination of employer size and information about the business grants, the division has been very careful to ensure that we're thinking through the racial equities that may occur due to the historic disparities and exclusion. We want to make sure that we people don't experience barriers when accessing these grant programs or when determining their employer size. While the grant application process for the assistance grants is intended to be simple and straightforward, we know that businesses owned by people of color could experience greater challenges in the grant application processes due to racial bias. Mackenzie, can you scroll up just a little bit? I mean, scroll down, so I'll keep reading there. Additionally, white-owned businesses generally have larger operating budgets than those owned by some of these marginalized communities, historically marginalized. That's just statistical data that has been available widespread in the past. Scrolling down just a little bit more. In developing the method for determining whether an employer has fewer than 25 employees, the division determined the count includes out-of-state employees to achieve equity across the program. This will ensure a more solid trust fund is established and that all large businesses, not just large businesses that have just a few staff only in Oregon, are paying their fair share of the employer portion of the contribution rate. Strategies to mitigate any unintended consequences. We do place a high value on developing and maintaining a diverse and inclusive culture. We're here today to discuss these equitable accesses for small businesses to receive the assistance grants. The division's goal is to ensure that there is equitable access to the grant. The division knows this will be a critical tool for employers who choose to elect into paying the employer portion of the contributions to utilize when their employees take leave. The division will be creating the frequently asked questions, the video instructions, guides, and other tools that we talked about earlier to expand awareness and education, making all of those materials available in multiple languages to mitigate some of the disparities. Lastly, the division will be conducting focused outreach and engagement activities from now through implementation to those communities, including those with English as a second language, Black, Indigenous, Latina, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander communities, to ensure there is broad understanding of the requirements of the program, and that there's assistance available when people have questions, when they need help determining their size, as well as when they are completing the grant applications. We are very welcome to any kind of input or any other impacts or mitigations that you're thinking of. And again, I know you just saw this morning for the first time, so if you could have comments back by next Wednesday, the 6th, we would appreciate it. And if there are no comments, then I'll throw it back to Shannon for the next category of rules.
I was just going to say, I was talking and realized I was on mute. So thanks, Lois. Are there any other comments or questions, suggestions for the statement of need before we move on to the next section? All right, so if you go back to your compilation document, we'll scroll down to page 14, and we're going to talk about the third section here, which is about equivalent plans. This section has 7 of the 38 administrative rules. So we're getting closer to the end here. And so before we get started on going through the administrative rules, I'm just going to do a quick summary of what is required in statute for equivalent plans. So Oregon Revised Statute 657B 210 to 657B 260 establishes that an employer may apply to the department to offer an equivalent plan for paid family medical leave benefits for its employees instead of participating in the state paid family medical leave plan. The equivalent plan must be made available to all employees who have been employed by the employer for 30 days. The plan must be equal to or greater than the plan offered by the state. When applying for an equivalent plan with the department can charge an application fee up to $250 to assist with the cost of processing. The employer of an equivalent plan can choose to have the employee pay part of the contributions, but the employee can't pay more than 60%. The employee's contributions received by the employer must be used for plan expenses and be in a separate fund and can't be used for other purposes. Today, we are to just have some of the administrative rules that we are going to talk about today, and we're still working on drafting additional administrative rules for equivalent plans. So the first administrative rule that we're going to go down to is definitions. This rule defines that equivalent plan is an approved plan by the department that is equal to or greater than the state plan. So again, definitions will be continuing to be added to this, this as we go through the rulemaking process, but this is a definition that we have at this time. The next administrative rule is for application requirements and effective date. So before an employer can offer an equivalent plan, oh, Paloma, sorry, before I go into that. I see your hand.
Mine's on that part, so go ahead and then I'll follow.
Okay. So for the rule on application requirements and effective date, before an employer can offer an equivalent plan to its employees, they must first submit an application to the department and have the application approved. The department won't review an incomplete application, and the application must include information about the employer, a copy of the equivalent plan, an attestation that the equivalent plan meets all the state plan requirements. A $250 fee is due at the time the application is submitted with every new application or in a reapproval application with substantial amendments to the equivalent plan that the department already approved, or if an amendment of the equivalent plan application is happening. $150 should be submitted with the application if it's just submitting it for reapproval. Remember, the first 3 years an equivalent plan has to be approved by the reapproved by the department, so that's where that $150 comes into play. And then equivalent plans becomes effective on the first day of the calendar quarter following the approval date. So it won't happen automatically. And that is in summary of what that administrative rule does. And Paloma.
Yeah, and I don't know if it makes sense to put it in the application requirements, but it would be helpful if we could have something, an express statement that equivalent plans can be self-funded or fully insured.
Great point. So yeah, there are multiple ways that equivalent plan can be done, and like you just said, it can be fully insured, which is they go out and purchase it from an insurance company, or self-funded, where they themselves run the plan. So I'll have to think about where to put that in administrative rule. But yeah, we do recognize there's more than one way equivalent plan can happen. So thanks for bringing that up. Other comments, questions about this rule before I go on to the next one? Okay, now the plan requirements rule. So if we scroll down on to page 15, this rule makes it clear what requirements the equivalent plan must have for the department to approve it. So for example, they need to cover all employees, full-time, part-time, or temporary employees. So you can't just choose some of the employees to offer the equivalent plan to. The leave and benefits have to be equal to or greater than the state plan benefits. And you have to make a reasonable effort to make the first 2 benefit payments to the employee within 2 weeks after receiving the claim, or the start of leave, whichever is later. That requirement is similar to what is required from us as a state employee, as not employee, state provider for the family medical leave. And so that's where we added that in rule as well. Questions on the plan requirements? Paloma.
Me again.
That's okay. I welcome all comments.
On the temporary employees, so on 1 here, maybe this just needs to be clarified. In most instances, a temporary employee is actually the employee of a staffing agency, not the employee of a business that has temporarily hired them. So I don't think they should be included under this, because they would be covered under the staffing agency's plan.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I have
a couple more.
Okay, go ahead.
Then on 2, I think this is just a wording thing, and I would change it to allow eligible employees to take leave at least equal to the duration of leave an eligible employee may take under 657B020. It's just a slight changing of the wording, I think, to make it a little bit clearer. And then, sorry, go ahead.
I know you have more. I just wanted we welcome all suggestions, because that is great to actually have the actual wording suggestion that you proposed. And the minute takers are capturing that. So thank you.
I will also submit
perfect
this in writing. And then on sub 7, I would say that claim decisions should be made within 2 weeks after receipt of a complete claim, or the start of leave, whichever is later. Claim payment within 1 week of claim decision. And I would also ask that we add some language here about what makes for a complete claim. So if for instance, an employee submitted their claim, but it was lacking the complete information, the employer can't, or insurer can't complete that process until they have a complete claim. So a claim that isn't complete, like you couldn't have the insurer then having to be paying benefits on something that's not complete.
Thanks for explaining that further. I was struggling with when you first said about what a complete claim was. So thank you for the example.
So just, I would say in here listing sort of what would have to be in the claim to trigger the obligation for that to be considered a complete claim for payment.
Thanks for all your comments, Paloma. Lois.
Yeah, thank you, because we've got people from our benefits team listening in, and this should apply for the state program too. As we're working on batch 3 rules right now around all the benefits, we do want to be able to define what is a complete claim. The statute requires that the state program also do whatever is reasonable to try to get payments to people as quickly as possible, hopefully within 2 weeks. So, but how do you define what's reasonably possible? So I love the suggestion, and I think it applies to the state program too when we get around to writing rules that cover that process as well. So thank you.
Katie.
Yeah, I will just thank you, quickly say and fully appreciate that this goes back to the challenge and the tension between what you put in, what's in statute and what you repeat in the rules. But I do think you know, when this it feels like the rule document will be more of a guide in terms of how folks look at the program and implement the program. So it does feel like calling out more specifically in the rules some of the pieces that are required in equivalent plans could really help folks make sure that they're ticking those boxes in terms of the equivalent plans, and putting that in the rules for reference, I think would be super helpful instead of going back to statute. So like who's covered, length of time, you know, kind of the basics.
Yeah, so if I understand your comment correctly, in like section 3, for example, we just say under 657B 340. So saying specific items under 657B 340 and spelling that out in the administrative rule.
Exactly. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, thanks. Andrea.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, Lois, your response and about the necessity to kind of identify a complete claim for both the state and equivalent plans. And just when we get to the place where we are talking about kind of auditing and kind of regular potential access barriers and issues, I'd love to kind of raise this again. You know, if we're seeing an uptick in any plan of incomplete claims, I want to flag that that's like an area for deeper investigation, like what's going on there that may be preventing people from submitting the correct paperwork or completing their claim in a timely way. I mean, of course, there's individuals who will, you know, have personal issues that may prevent that, but where there's a systemic issue, I'd love to make sure that we're more regularly auditing for that and addressing that if it's not already addressed, because I haven't read it thoroughly in the racial equity impact statement. Because I imagine that there can be additional challenging barriers for folks who may be operating with a first language other than English or something like that, and really making sure that we're addressing potential access issues as they arise in both the equivalent plans and in our state plan.
Thank you, Andrea. Great reminder and good comments. Thank you.
Yeah, great point. All right, if there's no further questions or comments or suggestions on the plan requirements, we'll go to the record keeping and department review. So this administrative rule states that the equivalent plan can be purchased. It doesn't state this, but this is where we come back to the comment earlier about fully insured versus self-insured. And so I just want to do a reminder that people can have a fully insured plan, equivalent plan, where they purchase from an insurance company, or they can insure it themselves, which is self-insured. And so if you choose a fully insured plan, the insurance requirements requires you to keep records for at least 6 years. And so we have chosen a rule here to require all equivalent plan employers to keep records for 6 years. We're still looking further into the authority for the 6-year requirement. And if we can't do that, then we'll be looking at allowing it for 3 years to be kept records like all employers are required to do in the statute. So that's how the rule is drafted right at the moment. Paloma.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, a 6-year record retention is will be challenging for employers. Most are sort of tying to other record retention schedules and would generally think that they would need to keep these for 3 years. So that would be our preference. The other thing is in 2, I think it would be important to be able to de-identify the individual information in these records. So maintaining the claim data, sort of the general process, but not having individual names, social security numbers on those documents. So that would be my ask of you.
Thanks, Paloma. So expanding on what type of information needs to be included, I'm hearing you would be helpful. So thanks for that.
Yeah.
All right, moving on to the rule about termination by the department. This rule states that the department can terminate an employer's equivalent plan for misuse of the employee contributions they're collecting. They can also terminate it for failure to follow the approved equivalent plan that they said they were going to follow, or for failure to follow the equal to or greater than state plan requirements, or if the department thinks the employer is at risk of not being able to pay the benefits. If the department thinks there is grounds for termination, we will send a letter to the employer with the termination date, and the employer needs to notify all employees within 5 days of the termination date that the equivalent plan is going to be going away. Upon termination, if an employee is receiving benefits from an equivalent plan, the state will continue the benefit payments for the remainder of the employee's leave. When terminated, the employer needs to give the department any remaining amounts they have collected from the employees for the plan, and turn it over to the state. When the termination date occurs from that date on, the employer needs to start participating in the state plan. And if someone is terminated, they can't reapply for an equivalent plan for 3 years. In summary, that is what the administrative rule does for termination by the department. Comments, questions, concerns, thoughts? Paloma?
Yeah, so on 4, I would just propose an edit. This says the employer is required to notify all employees of any equivalent plan termination within 5 days of learning of the termination, or within 5 days of the effective date of the termination. So if there's a lag there, I don't want an employer to be considered out of compliance, but they didn't know or didn't get the notice. So
yeah, I think the thought, just to follow up on that, Paloma, I think the thought was that the termination would be, the letter would have a date in the future. And so it would have time for them to notify the employees, but we're still thinking about that as well. So thanks for bringing that up, of how that will exactly work.
And then on 6, we would actually ask that the equivalent plan should be responsible for payment of claims incurred prior to the effective date of the plan termination. Transferring those to paid family leave or vice versa is likely complicated and will result in errors.
Can you expand on that just a little bit more?
Yeah, so if an employee has been covered by an equivalent plan, it needs, even if the equivalent plan is terminated, the equivalent plan needs to have the obligation for the remainder of that claim, because transferring the claim sort of mid-leave will create, I think, too many complications and too many possibilities for errors. And, both the employee and the employer have likely already paid into this insurance program, the equivalent plan, the insurance, or the self-insured employer is anticipating this expense already, transferring mid-leave would be very messy.
Thanks for that additional explanation. Other comments?
And then on 7, we would ask that the employer be allowed to keep any contributions that have been collected for a covered period where the plan was still in effect, but any collections for when the plan is not in effect will be remitted, but not for the period where the plan was in effect.
Okay. Others?
And then, sorry.
No, that's perfect. I welcome all.
And then on 9, we would ask that this would only apply to plans that have been formally terminated by department action. So 1, if an employer voluntarily terminated, they should be able to re-enter before 3 years. Or if there was an appeal that was ultimately overturned, they should be able to apply.
Yeah, so do you think that so we say right now terminated by the department, do you think we need to expand that by saying terminated by the department for the reasons as stated as in 1 of this administrative rule?
I think maybe a final termination by the department.
Thanks.
Would be helpful. So that's it for me on this section.
Okay, thank you so much. Others? All right, moving on to the rule on page 16 for termination by successor in interest.
Shannon,
Yeah.
I do want to remind everybody that we have about a half an hour left of our meeting, and we do have 2 more sections to get through. Not that I'm discouraging RAC members' comments. I just want everybody to be aware of the time.
Thanks, Anne. Luckily, the next 2 sections get smaller and smaller with the administrative rules that we're talking about. And so hopefully they will go a little quicker than the last ones, since we don't have 20 in that section. Okay, so termination by successor in interest. In this rule, it states if you are a successor in interest in a business that had an equivalent plan, you must continue the equivalent plan for that year unless there is a substantial reduction of personnel. We recognize we still need to define what substantial reduction of personnel actually means. And so we'll be doing that later. And if you qualify, you can submit a request to terminate within 90 days after becoming the successor in interest. So there's a time period to do that termination. In summary, that's what that rule is doing. Okay, moving on to the next rule then, if I don't hear anything, employer withdrawal, which is the start of, I think, page 17 on your compilation. So an employer can withdraw from the equivalent plan if the plan has been in effect for at least 1 year. To withdraw, you submit a withdrawal form at least 30 days prior to the effective date of the withdrawal to the department. And if an employer withdraws from the equivalent plan and they still have an employee on leave, they must continue paying the benefits until the leave ends or the total amount of benefit claimed is paid, whichever is first. Again, like the termination with the withdrawal, the employer needs to send the department any remaining amount they have collected from the employee for the plan. And we have received feedback that in the administrative rule, there is a requirement to let the department know about the withdrawal, but there's no requirement to let the employee know. And so we're looking at that rule in the statutory language to maybe have that added as well. So it's clear that the employee also needs to be informed of this withdrawal. Questions, comments, suggestions on employer withdrawal? All right, then we are going to move on to slide 13, which is the statement of need. And so if you want to pull up from your packet from this morning, equivalent plan statement of need. I'll get mine pulled up as well.
And while you guys are all doing that, people that have been putting questions in the chat, if you could please put those in the Q&A so that we can make sure that we get a detailed, full, robust FAQ out for everybody onto the website. That would be incredibly helpful of you.
Thanks, Anne. So if you scroll down to page 3, the fiscal and economic impact for these administrative rules, we feel because the administrative rule that requires the $250 fee per equivalent plan application is actually an administrative rule because it was up to that amount in statute. We feel this will create a fiscal impact to the paid family medical leave fund of approximately $33,750 a year. And how we've calculated that was based on Washington's application process. There, we anticipate to get about 135 applications a year based on their numbers. And so if you take 135 times the 250, we get to the $33,750. Again, this is our best estimate. We know it's just one state that we are looking at, and there's lots of other states in that we can look at as well. And as well, you don't know what's going to happen in Oregon. And so again, this is just our point in time estimate. Moving on to the small business impact, which this cost of compliance section that is where we talk about the impact of state agencies and small businesses again. We feel that the impact on state agencies, local governments, and other public bodies all depend if they choose to have an equivalent plan instead of a state plan. And we don't know how many of those state agencies or local governments are actually going to choose to do that. So we've left it pretty open because it's been difficult to figure that out. Effect on small businesses. So again, it's the same numbers of having approximately 126,000 small businesses and not knowing if those are going to be going into equivalent plan, accepting equivalent plan or not. Again, we are estimating 135 applications for those will occur. And this is erring on the side of cautious because we don't know how many of them are going to be small or large of those 135 applications. So we just assume that all of them are going to be small businesses of the 135 applicants. And the reporting and record keeping comes into play when a small business submits an equivalent plan application. And the 6 years they need to keep the records of which employees they took the leave, the duration of leave, and the benefit amount paid. Since the record keeping requirements for those 3 years is already in statute, it is just the additional 3 years of storage that is required by this administrative rule. So the next question we had to answer is any equipment, supplies, labor, or increased administration for these administrative rules? And again, it depends on how the equivalent plan is administered. Remembering our earlier discussion about fully insured versus self-insured, this will depend on how much administration it will require of a business to offer an equivalent plan. It also depends on how many employees one has. So that's also a time depending on how long it takes if you have one employee versus several employees. The administrative rule just clarifies what type of information you'll need to be kept. So again, per the Bureau of Labor Statistics, at a professional cost of $56.24 per hour, the amount of hours needed will vary greatly. And again, we welcome any of your comments and feedback on this because it is something that we haven't done before and are just estimating based on the best information we have available. And again, the involvement and the development of the rules, we talked about some of these at the advisory committee meeting, and we also had an equivalent plan work group, which had 14 members. And the work group met 10 times over the last year to discuss these various topics. And just summarizing what documents we relied upon, here are just a few. Again, the paid family medical leave statutes, the unemployment insurance administrative rules, the Washington State's administrative rule on equivalent plans, the Employer Retirement Income Security Act for regulations on insurance programs, and Department of Consumer Business Services administrative rules and laws around insurance providers. In summary, that is what we have written on the statement of need for equivalent plans and the small business impact. But again, welcome any of your feedback and recognizing you just got this tip this morning. And so if you can provide that to us by October 6th or here today, that would be wonderful.
And then, thank you, Shannon. Real quickly, we'll go ahead and just, again, read through a little bit of the racial equity impact that we've identified. In drafting these administrative rules related to the adoption of equivalent plans, the division has been careful to ensure that we're thinking about racial equity, inequity that may occur. Due to systemic barriers and racial disparities in the past, it is more likely that Black, Indigenous, Latina, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, and other people of color-owned businesses may not understand the full breadth of options related to the program, including the option to apply for approval of and management of an equivalent plan instead of using the state's plan. Additionally, the division believes awareness of the equivalent plan, statutes, and administrative rules navigating the equivalent plan application and fee process, as well as the annual renewal process, could potentially cause difficulties or be a difficult process for non-English speakers or anyone of those previously mentioned communities and groups. Strategies to mitigate those consequences. We are placing a high priority on the development and maintaining a diverse and inclusive culture and ensuring that there is equitable access to understanding about the equivalent plan process, administrative rules, and procedures for all businesses. The division's goal is to ensure that there is equitable access in the process of a business choosing to apply and receive approval for an equivalent plan instead of the state plan. The division will make the information, tools, and processes accessible. The division is working with our technology vendor to ensure that the registration process for businesses is accessible and available in multiple languages, as well as that we will have a paper process and staff ready to assist in the application and ongoing requirements. The division will be creating the frequently asked questions, video instruction, and equivalent plan guide for employers, and other tools to expand awareness and education, making all materials available in multiple languages to mitigate some of those disparities. And lastly, the division will be conducting focused outreach and engagement activities from now until and through implementation to those communities as well. Again, I realize you haven't had a lot of time to look at these equivalent plans through this lens of an racial equity, but we would ask that you do so over the next week and get back to us with any other thoughts.
Thanks, Lois. So moving on to slide 14, we are on our 4th out of the 5 sections. So we're almost done. This is the second to last section, like I just said, and it has 4 administrative rules. So just a little recap about the self-employed individuals and what's required in statute. ORS 657B 130 establishes that self-employed individuals, which includes independent contractors, may elect to participate in the state paid family medical leave program. So you don't have to be just an employee to participate in the program. The election can't be less than 3 years, and the election begins on the date the notice to elect to participate is filed with the department. So going over the rules, they start on page 17 of your compilation for self-employed, and the first rule is eligibility. A self-employed individual can elect to participate in the state paid family medical leave plan if they earn at least $1,000 in Oregon net income from self-employment in the prior calendar year. They file a notice to elect to participate with the department and provide all the required documentation. And they were not terminated from an equivalent plan, elective coverage within the last 3 years. The statute says taxable income, but it wasn't clear if that taxable income meant gross income, which is income minus cost of goods sold, or if that taxable income meant net income, which is income minus all expenses. And so we had a lot of discussions about using gross versus net, and we have landed on net, recognizing that no matter which one we choose, gross or net, there's always going to be winners and losers. ultimately, we decided to go with net income to keep it equitable for all self-employed individuals, because there's many different types of self-employed individuals, like sole proprietorships, partnerships, S corporations, etc. And the partners and shareholders of an S corporation won't know the business gross income, as it isn't reported on their K-1 they receive. So we decided to go with net income. That is just one of the reasons why. In summary, that is what the first rule talks about. Questions, comments, concerns? Okay, moving on to the election. Oh, Amanda.
Sorry, I'm trying to manage a second work group right now. So I just wanted to make a couple quick comments of this. I feel bad because I feel like this section gets left behind a little bit just because we don't necessarily have probably maybe the right people on this call. And we on the employer side can probably do a little bit better and reach out to our realtor colleagues and others that have more individuals in this section. But I appreciated the notes, I think, on the termination. I will say, and maybe it's not in the OARs, but maybe it's just in the forms, that this would just be a flag. I really think it's important to lead with that termination. I think the idea that you're committing to an independent contractor status for 3 years as a former self-employed individual would scare me from probably even getting past the first paragraph. And so I just think it needs to be, it's a little bit buried. It's like third page of this section. So it took me a while to get there. And then the only piece that I would flag is, it seemed a little confusing to me about, so there's a section on, so say if I have a change in employment status, I guess the question would be for those that maintain an independent contractor status, but perhaps pick up part-time work. Does it kick them out of the program? Do they have to initiate that change in status? Does that then, based on sub 9 forever or for 3 years, allow them to never be able to reapply? It seems like that would be the way I would read that. You can't return to self-employed kind of designation, and just how that, if you wanted to continue to pay in for both, can you make that work so you're getting the greatest access to that benefit payment? And then, yeah, just cleaning up that sub 9. I'm not entirely sure where we prohibited folks from coming back if their status changed. And I'd sure hate to say to somebody who perhaps wasn't an in-house employee and then went into become an independent contractor that wasn't allowed eligibility of the program just because, the job market's a little fluid right now for everyone. And so if we want to make sure the greatest folks get access to this, we want to make it as flexible and reasonable as we can.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. To answer your question about if they're self-employed and then they also work as an employee, would they not be no longer eligible for self-employed? And that's not the way that we're understanding it. That they would have both the self-employed and the wages would be factored into their benefits. But again, we'll be starting to touch the benefit section. And so we'll be talking about that more later. But just because you are an employee and self-employed doesn't mean that you no longer qualify for the self-employed portion. All right, moving on to the administrative rule on election requirements and the effective date. So what this rule does is it states a self-employed individual can elect to participate in the program at any time. And we talked a lot about this and we are developing this policy because we talked about having an open enrollment period like you see when choosing like an insurance plan, for example. But we chose not to do that as we want to, again, create an opportunity for as many self-employed individuals to participate as much as possible. And so not having just a window of time allows for maybe more to participate. The notice to elect must include the individual's information, the information on their business. It also has to include their total Oregon net income from the prior calendar year and documentation verifying their identity and income, and they agree to pay contributions for not less than 3 years, and provide any net income documentation the department thinks is necessary to for that, and other information the department requests, and acknowledge that you can't terminate it for 3 years. So those are the requirements for the election and effective date for self-employed individuals. Questions, comments, concerns on that? Okay, moving on to the contribution payments and reporting requirements. This administrative rule explains the rate at which the self-employed individual has to pay. The statute allows the department to determine the rate, but it can't be more than 1%. So we talked a lot about if it should be the entire contribution rate amount up to the 1%, or should it be 60% of the contribution rate, which matches what wage employees pay, or should it be 40%, which matches what employers pay? So we decided in this administrative rule to go with the 60%, which matches what the employees pay, as we feel that closely aligned. This rule also explains that payments on the contributions are due quarterly, and that you figure the quarterly amount by dividing the income from the prior year by four quarters. The payment due dates are the same as the combined payroll quarterly report due dates. Now, even though the payments are due quarterly, self-employed individuals only have to report their income annually. They will not be reporting on the Oregon Combined Payroll Report, as we felt this would be very confusing, as all the other taxes on that report do not pertain to self-employed individuals. We will have a mechanism for the reporting we'll create a mechanism for the reporting to occur, and the income information is due April 30th, which is after the April 15th tax filing deadline. If a self-employed individual files their taxes on extension, they calculate their quarterly payment from the prior year's tax return that was filed, and will provide the tax return information by October 31st, which is after the October 15th extension due date. And the department will true up that information. So in summary, that is what happens in the contribution payments and reporting requirements rule. Question, comments, suggestions? Okay, moving on to termination. A self-employed individual can terminate after it has been 3 or more years. The termination takes effect 30 days after they submit the notice to terminate with the department, or the date they specify, whichever is later. They can terminate if it has been less than 3 years, if they file for bankruptcy or no longer self-employed and don't qualify. The department can terminate their coverage if they are delinquent on their contributions. If the department terminates their coverage, then you can't re-elect for coverage for 3 years. In summary, that is the termination administrative rule, what that says. Questions? We have gotten through all of the self-employed administrative rules. Is there any questions on the overall package of those or suggestions? All right, then we're going to move to slide 15, which is a statement of need for self-employed individuals. And again, pull up in your packet of information the self-employed statement of need, and Mackenzie has it up there. And if you scroll down to page 3 is where the fiscal and economic impact section is. Because the administrative rule stated the contribution amount for a self-employed individual will be 60% of the total paid family medical leave contribution rate, we feel this creates a fiscal impact to the fund. And now I admit, I don't know how we should show this impact, as we could have done it up to the total PFMLI contribution rate of 1%. So I don't know if we should be showing the difference between the max of 1% and the 60% that we chose, or of how exactly we should do it. But my stab at taking this on is I based it on the entire 60%. So based on the Department of Revenue's 2018 statistics, the average net income for a sole proprietorship, which is just looking at the Schedule C filers, was on average $25,500 in a year. Based on that average, someone could pay $153, which is multiplying the $25,500 by 1%, which is the maximum contribution rate, and then multiplying that by 60% to get to the $153. Then I multiplied the $153 by the 1,025 self-employed individuals that we think will elect to participate in the program. That's based off of Washington State's numbers of how many people they're having participate in the self-employed program, and to determine how much became into the fund for the calendar year. Again, I welcome any comments on this, because this, I feel like there's multiple ways that we could do this here, and welcome any feedback or comments on that. So it gets to a total of $156,825. Scrolling down under the statement and cost of compliance for small businesses. This rule doesn't impact, we feel, state agencies or local governments because they're not considered self-employed individuals. And the effect on small businesses, per the American Community Survey, Oregon has approximately 228,000 self-employed individuals. Since all those self-employed individuals could elect to participate, these rules could impact all of them. However, as we stated previously, we anticipate about 0.45% will likely participate, or at 1,025 individuals. And continuing to scroll down, the record and reporting requirements could come into play when a self-employed individual elects to participate. They will need to fill out the application and submit the documentation verifying their identity and the Oregon net income from self-employment. They will also need to pay paid family medical leave contributions quarterly and provide proof of income annually. Based on our best guess, we think it would take 2 hours a quarter to submit payments and gather the proof of documentation. Again, I welcome, that's just our best guess, and so I welcome any feedback that you have on that. And the next question is, there's any equipment, supplies, labor, or increased administration for these administrative rules? Again, as we stated previously, we think it will take less than 2 hours to administer, and we're not aware of any equipment or supplies that will be required because of these administrative rules. And the same stuff that we've already talked about, how small businesses were involved and the documents relied upon. In summary, that is for the statement of need for self-employed. As you have any comments, questions, hey, we're way off base, anything, that would be greatly welcomed.
Let's go ahead and real quickly review the racial equity impacts for this particular statement of need. If you could scroll to that part of the form, Mackenzie. Just to let you know what we've considered a little bit here for the questions that we posed. The PFMLI division anticipates that fewer than the percentage of the Black, Indigenous, Latina, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, other people of color of self-employed individuals as a percentage of the population will enroll in the program due to the historic exclusion and systemic inequity and lack of access to employment and benefit programs nationwide. This is one of a few programs nationally and in Oregon that allows self-employed individuals to participate. Therefore, in drafting these administrative rules, the division considered ways to ensure that we're opening up access to the program equitably for underrepresented and marginalized self-employed individuals. Additionally, the division believes awareness of the self-employed part of the law and administrative rules, as well as applying to participate, could be a difficult process for non-English speaking or other members of these groups. Strategies to mitigate. Again, we place a high emphasis on this topic, especially in relation to self-employed individuals. The division is working with our technology vendor to ensure the registration process for self-employed individuals is accessible and available in multiple language, as well as having the paper process and staff ready to assist them. Keep in mind, self-employed individuals don't currently participate on the combined filing report, and so this will be additional outreach and additional new reporting for them. The division will be creating those frequently asked questions, instructions, videos, self-employment guide, and other tools, and making all of those available in multiple language to help with any marginalized communities from now into the future. We are determined that in order to encourage greater self-employed participation in the program and equity for income and access, self-employed individuals who opt into the program would pay the 60% that Shannon explained, which aligns with the amount paid by employees as opposed to the entire contribution rate of up to 1%. I'm happy to receive your input on that.
Thanks, Lois. And like you said earlier, it's if you can receive your input by October 6th, that would be greatly appreciated. Okay, guys, we're on the last administrative rule, which is this outreach plan. And so you can scroll down to the last page is a compilation, which talks about our outreach administrative rule. The statute requires us to put in rule our outreach plan. And so I took a stab at drafting this rule. I looked at all of their state agencies, and I think we're the first one out there that has an outreach plan in an administrative rule. So this is our best stab at it, and welcome any feedback. It states that we'll establish an outreach and community engagement plan, identifying persons, groups, and organizations impacted by the program and developing strategies for engaging those stakeholders, which we have done. We have created that plan already. And outreach activities include, but aren't limited to, public awareness campaigns, community outreach events, surveys, focus groups, town halls, workshops, and stakeholder interviews. As we are committed to collaborating with community-based, cultural-specific, and advocacy organizations serving historically marginalized and immigrant communities to ensure equitable access to all information. In summary, that is our outreach rule. And again, welcome any comments, thoughts, questions, feedback. Then moving to slide 17, we'll just briefly go over the statement of need for outreach. And again, that's in your documentation, and then Mackenzie can pull up on the screen here. And scrolling down for the fiscal and economic impact, we don't anticipate a fiscal and economic impact as the statute requires us to do this outreach and engagement. The small business impact for cost of compliance section, we again don't feel that these impact state agencies or local governments. However, they'll be likely participating in these outreach activities. And the effect on small businesses is our goal is to have as many small businesses as possible participate in this outreach plan. That is in summary the impact for the fiscal impact and small business. And again, welcome your thoughts and comments on that. And I'm turning back over to Lois.
Okay, let's quickly run through the racial equity impact again for this one as well. Outreach here, so important to reach all Oregonians with this plan. By drafting and administering this rule, I'm trying to get to the part that's the intent is that the division will get closer to achieving racial equity for these marginalized communities. Based on research, we know that marginalized communities may not know as much about the program. That's the whole reason for having this outreach plan. For example, small businesses may not have a designated human resource employee, and that may impact communities facing racial injustice more acutely than others. National data is clear that compared to white workers, Latino, Latinx workers are 66% more likely, Black workers are 83% more likely, and Native American, Pacific Islander, and multiracial workers 100% more likely to be unable to take leave when needed. Inability to afford unpaid leave is the most common reason for needing leave, but not being able to take it, followed by the fear of losing a job. Access to and understanding of the leave laws for marginalized communities will not be achieved unless adequate outreach to these communities is achieved. These communities are more likely to be denied access to leave and other benefits by employers other than their white counterparts. And again, this is just based on national study data that we are very aware of. The division places a high priority. By adopting this outreach plan and administrative rule, the division demonstrates that the department is firmly committed to doing robust engagement throughout the implementation of the program as it pertains to racial bias and inequity. Our goal is to implement a system with equity-centered in decision-making and with feedback and input from all communities. And as I mentioned earlier, we have engaged a communications vendor to help us do this, not only with mass communication to get the word out about this program, but also we plan multiple outreach activities in the coming year to help reach these communities as well. And I know we are very short on time, and I'm going to ask Anne and Mackenzie to put up the final slide so that people know what's happening next. Let's skip to the what comes next with the formal rulemaking. I want to apologize that we ran out of time today, but we had very good discussion. And if we didn't get to your questions, if it didn't get answered in the Q&A or the chat, please do send those into our OED mailbox. We will try to get back to you individually if we can, or we will include your input on a question and answers from today's session. Where we're at again today is that our batch 1 notice of rulemaking is planned to be published in the Oregon Bulletin on November 1. We will be incorporating and evaluating the comments that we've received today and that we continue to receive through our mailbox between now and that time. So you may see a little bit different version on November 1, incorporating some of the comments that we've received to date. That will start the formal rulemaking process for batch 1. We plan to hold public hearings in mid-December. So that gives you about at least 6 weeks to evaluate those rules. You're welcome to provide us comments in writing or come to the public hearing and verbally relay your information as well. We will then consider all of that input before providing our director with finalized rules to make permanent. Approximately January 1st now, but depending on the process, that could get pushed back. But our goal is to have those in place by January 1. Our rules page here is listed. This is for the department's formal rulemaking page. You're welcome to go there and access the rules once we get past that November 1st date. Right now, our draft rules are out on the PFMLI webpage, and we will keep it updated with the dates of all upcoming batches and public hearings as well. Email us your questions. And what else am I forgetting as we're at 12 o'clock right now?
Well, we're going to take all of the questions and answers from the Q&A and put it on an FAQ, put it on the website. The PowerPoint from today will also be posted on the PFMLI's website where the advisory information is. Again, the email address is oed_rules@oregon.gov. And then I promise to forward your emails and questions on to the program. And then I think that's it. Until next time, thank you everybody for sticking it out and having a robust conversation and really giving us your honest feedback. That is the purpose of these RAC meetings. And I'm really excited to see what comes out of these conversations.
Thank you for participating today.